I'm 81 years old, and I've spent the last 7 years trying to answer a question my grandson asked me when he was 8. He looked up at me with those curious eyes and asked, "Grandpa, why did you become an accountant?" I opened my mouth to answer, and nothing came out. Nothing. I had spent 55 years in that career, 55 years of spreadsheets and audits and quarterly reports, and I couldn't tell an 8-year-old why I'd done any of it. That question broke something open in me, or maybe it broke something that needed to be broken. You see, I had spent my entire adult life answering what and how. What should I do? What do I need to accomplish? How do I get ahead? How do I provide for my family? But I never asked why. Why this career? Why this house? Why this life? I just did. I followed the path. I checked the boxes. I moved from one milestone to the next without ever stopping to ask if any of it actually meant something to me. And now at 81, I finally understand what I missed. So I'm going to tell you something that might upset you, something that might make you uncomfortable, something that might make you look at your own life and feel a cold shiver run down your spine. I hope it does, because if I can save you from the regret I carry every single day, then this conversation will be worth it. I wasted 55 years of my life answering the wrong questions. 55 years, that's not a typo, that's not an exaggeration. From age 23 until my grandson asked me that question at 74, I never once stopped to ask myself why. And by the time I figured out the right questions to ask, most of my life was already gone. 7 years ago, my wife passed away. Her name was Margaret. We'd been married for 56 years. 56 years. That's longer than most people are alive. She had cancer, ovarian. By the time they found it, there wasn't much they could do. 3 months from diagnosis to the end. I held her hand in that hospital room. I watched her grow weaker. I watched her slip away from me, piece by piece, day by day. And in those final weeks, she said something I'll never forget. "Frank," she whispered, "what was it all for?" I didn't have an answer. She died on a Tuesday. It was raining. I remember the sound of the water against the hospital window. I remember thinking it was strange that the world just kept going. The rain kept falling. Cars kept driving past. People kept living their lives. But mine had just stopped. The funeral was 3 days later. Our children came. Our grandchildren came. People I hadn't seen in decades showed up to pay their respects. And then everyone left. Everyone goes home after the funeral. Did you know that? They bring casseroles and flowers, and they tell you they're sorry, and then they go back to their lives, and you're left alone. I was sitting in my living room. The house was quiet, quieter than it had ever been in 50 years. And my grandson walked in, Benjamin. He was staying with me for a few days. His parents thought I shouldn't be alone. He sat down next to me on the couch. He didn't say anything for a while, just sat there. Then he looked up at me and asked, "Grandpa, why did you become an accountant?" Just like that, out of nowhere, the way children do. I started to give him the answer I'd given 100 times before. "Well, Ben, it was a stable career and it provided," but I stopped because I realized I wasn't answering his question. He hadn't asked what accounting provided. He hadn't asked how I got into it. He asked why, and I didn't know. I sat there looking at this 8-year-old boy, and I felt my whole life flash before my eyes. But it wasn't like the movies describe it. It wasn't a highlight reel of beautiful moments. It was a series of decisions I had made without ever understanding why. Why accounting? Because my father said it was practical. Why Margaret? Because she was nice and it was time to get married. Why that house? Because it was in a good school district. Why that church? Because that's where Margaret's family went. Why those friends? Because they were the other accountants at the firm. Every single major decision in my life had been made in response to external expectations, practicality, or coincidence. Not once had I stopped to ask myself, what do I actually want? What matters to me? What do I believe? I looked at my grandson. I don't know, Ben, I said. I don't know why I became an accountant. His face scrunched up. You don't know? No, I said. I never asked myself that question. And then he said something that hit me like a punch to the chest. That's weird, Grandpa. I ask myself why all the time. He's right. Children ask why constantly. Why is the sky blue? Why do dogs bark? Why do we have to go to bed? And somewhere along the way we stop asking. We start asking what and how. What career should I pursue? How do I get promoted? What house should I buy? How do I make more money? But we stop asking why. Why do I want this career? Why do I want this promotion? Why do I want this house? Why am I doing any of this? That question from my grandson, that simple, innocent question, sent me into a spiral that lasted months, because once I started asking why, I couldn't stop, and I didn't like the answers I was finding. Let me take you back to the beginning. I was 23 years old. I had just graduated from college with a degree in literature. I loved books. I loved reading. I loved analyzing stories and understanding what made them work. My father sat me down at the kitchen table. I can still see him there. He had coffee. He always had coffee. Frank, he said, what are you going to do with your life? I told him I wanted to be a writer, maybe teach literature, maybe work at a publishing house. He laughed, not a mean laugh, a tired laugh, a you don't understand how the world works laugh. You need a real career, he said. Something stable, something that pays. You have a good head for numbers. Why not accounting? I didn't argue. I didn't push back. I didn't ask myself if I even wanted that life. I just nodded, and I spent the next 51 years as an accountant. Do you see what happened there? I let someone else answer my why. My father's why was stability, security, not struggling like he did. But those weren't my whys. Those were his whys. And I adopted them without ever questioning if they fit who I actually was. That became the pattern of my entire life. At 26, I met Margaret. She was nice. She was kind. Her family liked me. Everyone said we'd make a good match. When are you going to settle down? My mother asked. So I proposed. Not because I had deeply examined what I wanted in a partner, not because I had asked myself why I wanted to spend my life with this particular person, because it was time, because it was expected, because that's what you did. At 30, we had our first child. At 32, our second. Did I ask myself why I wanted children? Did I examine what kind of father I wanted to be and why? No, I just followed the script. At 35, I got promoted to senior accountant. More money, more responsibility, more hours. Did I ask myself why I wanted this promotion? Did I consider what I'd be sacrificing and whether it was worth it? No, I just said yes, because that's what you do. At 40, I had my first real moment of doubt. I was sitting in my office at 9 o'clock at night. The building was empty. I was going over someone else's financial statements looking for errors. And a thought floated through my mind. Is this all there is? Do you know what I did with that thought? I pushed it away. I told myself I was just tired. I told myself I should be grateful for what I had. I did not ask myself why I was spending my life this way. So I stayed. Another 20 years, another 30. At 50, the same doubt came back, stronger this time. You're halfway through your life, it whispered. What are you doing? And again, I pushed it away. When I retire, I told myself, when I retire, I'll figure out what I really want. I'll read those books I've been putting off. I'll write. I'll travel. I'll finally ask myself the big questions. So I waited. At 60, I thought about early retirement. We had enough saved. We could have lived comfortably, but Margaret was nervous. What if we ran out of money? What if there were medical expenses? What if? So I stayed. 5 more years. At 65, I retired. Do you know what I did with all that free time I'd been dreaming about for 40 years? Nothing. I didn't know how. I didn't know who I was without the spreadsheets and the meetings and the quarterly reports. I didn't know what I wanted because I had never asked myself why I wanted anything. I just existed, day after day. Golf games I didn't enjoy. TV shows I didn't care about, waiting for something to happen. And then Margaret got sick, and then she died, and then my grandson asked me that question, and I finally started asking why. 55 years too late, let me tell you about the biggest lie you've probably ever been told. You've been told that the why doesn't matter, that it's impractical, that it's navel-gazing, that what matters is action, results, productivity. Stop asking questions and just do the work. Don't overthink it. Just get it done. Sound familiar? That's what I was told. That's what most of us are told, and it's a lie. Because here's what happens when you never ask why. You spend your whole life climbing a mountain only to realize you didn't want to be at the top. You build a career that impresses everyone, but means nothing to you. You live a life that looks perfect on the outside and feels empty on the inside. I was successful. By every external measure, I was successful. Good career, nice house, 2 children, 4 grandchildren, retirement savings, the whole package. And I felt nothing, because none of it was chosen consciously. None of it was built on a foundation of understanding who I was and what I actually wanted. I had answered what and how for 55 years, but I never answered why. Here's another lie. You don't have time to ask why. You're too busy. There's too much to do. The bills need to be paid. The kids need to be driven to soccer. The deadline is tomorrow. No time for philosophical questions. No time for self-reflection. No time to stop and examine your life. Bull, you have time. You're just afraid of what you might find. I was afraid that's the truth. I was terrified that if I stopped and asked myself why, I might discover that I'd been living someone else's life. So I stayed busy. I stayed distracted. I stayed on the hamster wheel. Because running feels safer than thinking. Do you know who else never asked why? My friend Robert. He was an accountant too. Same firm, same career path, same life script. Robert died 5 years ago. Heart attack. He was at his desk looking at a spreadsheet. At his funeral, his son gave the eulogy. Do you know what he said? My father was a hard worker. That was it. That was the defining characteristic his own son could come up with. Not my father was passionate. Not my father lived fully. Not my father knew who he was and what he wanted. Just, he worked hard. Is that what you want them to say about you? Is that your legacy? They showed up. They did the work. They never made waves. I watched Robert's funeral and I felt cold because I knew they could have said the same thing about me. Hard worker, good provider, never asked why. That's not a life. That's an existence. And I didn't realize it until it was almost too late. You want to know what haunts me? Not the big dramatic things, not the obvious mistakes. It's the small moments, the quiet opportunities I let slip away because I never asked myself what I actually wanted. Let me tell you about some of them. When I was 34, a small publishing house in Boston offered me a job, an editor position, entry level, sure, less money than I was making, but it was books. It was literature. It was the thing I had loved before I let my father's voice become my own. I still remember holding that letter, reading it over and over. Margaret asked me what I was going to do. I can't, I said. We have the mortgage. We have the kids. It's not practical. I never asked myself why I wanted to stay in accounting. I never asked why security mattered more than meaning. I just defaulted to the safe choice. I threw that letter away. I still think about it. 47 years later, I still think about it. Here's another one. When my son David was 12, he asked me to coach his little league team. He was so excited. He had this vision of us together on the field, him looking up at me from the pitcher's mound. I said no. Too busy with work, I told him. Maybe next season. Next season never came. David is 53 now. We talk on holidays. We're polite. But there's a distance between us that I can trace back to moments like that one. All those times I chose work over him. All those times I never asked myself why the quarterly report mattered more than my son's face lighting up when he saw me at his games. I missed it. I missed all of it. Missed. Here's another one that keeps me up at night. My mother died when I was 48. She had been sick for months. I knew it was coming, but I didn't go home to see her as much as I should have. The drive was 4 hours. I had deadlines. I had responsibilities. The last time I saw her conscious, she looked at me and said, "I wish we had talked more, Frankie." She called me Frankie. She was the only one who ever called me that. I held her hand and promised I would visit more often. She died 3 days later. I never got to have the conversation she wanted to have. I never got to ask her about her life, her regrets, her wisdom. I was too busy answering emails. Why were those emails more important than my dying mother? I never asked, I just assumed. There's a journal on my bookshelf, leather-bound, beautiful. Margaret gave it to me for my 40th birthday. "For all those thoughts you never write down," she said. I opened it once, wrote the date at the top of the first page. Then I closed it. "I'll start tomorrow," I told myself, "when I have more time." That journal has been sitting on my shelf for 41 years, still empty except for that one date, March 15th, 1984. 41 years of thoughts I never examined, 41 years of questions I never asked, 41 years of why that I never explored. All because I kept waiting for the perfect moment. There's more. The trip to Ireland I never took. My grandfather came from County Cork. I always said I'd go there someday, walk the streets he walked, understand where I came from. Someday never came. The piano lessons I quit at 14 because my father said they were a waste of time. I never picked it up again. 67 years without music. The novel I outlined in college, 3 notebooks full of ideas. I found them in a box in my attic last year. The pages had yellowed, the ink had faded, but the ideas were good. They were really good, and I never wrote a single chapter. Why? Because I never asked myself why writing mattered to me. I never asked why I was willing to give up on something I loved. I never asked why someone else's definition of practical became more important than my own definition of meaningful. I just stopped. The worst part, I could have done all of these things. There was time, there was money, there were opportunities, but I never gave myself permission to want them, because wanting requires knowing why you want, and I was too scared to ask. After Margaret died, after my grandson asked me that question, something shifted. I was 74 years old. Most people would say it was too late for transformation. They would be wrong. I started small. I started asking myself why about everything. Why do I eat breakfast at 7 o'clock every morning? Because I always have. Why do I watch the news even though it makes me anxious? Because that's what I've always done. Why do I keep clothes in my closet that I never wear? Because, I don't know, it sounds silly, doesn't it? An old man examining his breakfast habits. But that's how it starts. You ask the small questions, and they lead to the bigger ones. Why did I spend 51 years in a career that meant nothing to me? Why did I let my father's fears become my own? Why did I never tell Margaret what I really felt about our life together? Why did I miss so much of my children's lives? Why did I wait until I was 74 years old to start asking these questions? The answers weren't comfortable. They forced me to look at myself honestly, to see all the ways I had lived unconsciously, to grieve for the life I could have had. but there was freedom in it too. Because once you start asking why, you start making different choices. At 75, I enrolled in a writing class at the community center. I was the oldest person there by 30 years. "Why are you here?" the instructor asked me on the first day. And for the first time in my life, I had an answer. "Because I've always wanted to write," I said. "Because I spent 50 years telling myself I couldn't. Because I'm ready to stop listening to voices that aren't mine." I've written 4 short stories now. They're not masterpieces, but they're mine. I finally went to Ireland. At 77 years old, I walked the streets of County Cork. I stood where my grandfather might have stood. I asked myself why my roots mattered to me. And I cried, not from sadness, from finally allowing myself to want something, to feel something, to be something more than an empty vessel going through the motions. I reconnected with David, my son. I called him one day and said something I'd never said before. "I'm sorry," I told him. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I chose work over you. I'm sorry I never asked myself why being present for you mattered more than any promotion." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, It's not too late, Dad." He was right. It wasn't too late. Not entirely. We talk every week now, real conversations, not just holiday check-ins. I'm finally being the father I should have been 40 years ago. I'm 81 now. 7 years since Margaret died. 7 years since my grandson asked me that question. And these have been the best 7 years of my life. Not because everything is perfect, not because I've undone all my regrets, but because I finally know why I'm doing what I'm doing. Every day I ask myself, why am I making this choice? Why does this matter to me? Why am I spending my limited time on this particular thing? And when I don't have a good answer, I make a different choice. That's the transformation, not a complete reinvention, just a simple practice. Ask why. Listen to the answer. Choose accordingly. I spent 74 years not doing that. Now I can't imagine living any other way. So here's my question for you. Why are you living the life you're living? Not what are you doing? Not how are you doing it? Why? Why that job? Why that relationship? Why that city? Why those friends? Why those goals? Can you really answer, or would you freeze like I did when an 8-year-old asked you to explain your choices? I think most people would freeze, because most people have never asked themselves why. They're doing what they're doing because that's what they've always done, because that's what they were told to do, because that's what everyone else is doing. They're living someone else's answers to someone else's questions, and they don't even realize it. That might be you. Right now, today, you might be living a life that isn't really yours. Does that scare you? It should, because one day you're going to be 81 years old. One day you're going to look back on your life and ask yourself what it all meant. And if you haven't been asking why all along, you won't have an answer. I know what you're thinking. I'm too busy to ask myself philosophical questions. I have responsibilities. That's a luxury for people who don't have to pay bills. I thought the same things for 55 years, and it was all avoidance. The truth is you're scared. You're scared that if you ask why, you'll discover that your life doesn't make sense, that the things you've sacrificed for don't actually matter to you, that you've been running in the wrong direction. So you stay busy, you stay distracted, you keep your head down and push forward, and years pass, decades pass, and then someone you love dies, or you get a diagnosis, or a child asks you a simple question, and you realize you've been asleep for most of your life. Don't wait for that moment. Ask yourself now, why are you doing what you're doing? And if you don't have a good answer, change. You think you have time to figure it out later? You don't. Nobody does. I thought I had time. I thought retirement would be when I'd finally examine my life. I thought there would always be another season, another year, another chance. There wasn't. There isn't. Time is the only truly non-renewable resource you have, and you're spending it every single day on things you've never even questioned, is that the life you want? If I could go back and talk to my 23-year-old self, here's what I would tell him. Stop. Stop taking other people's answers as your own. Stop assuming that the practical choice is the right choice. Stop waiting for permission to want things. Stop being too busy to think about what you're doing and why. Stop running from the questions that scare you. Stop pretending that success and meaning are the same thing. Stop. Just stop and start. Start asking why before you make any major decision. Start examining the beliefs you inherited from your parents. Start writing down your thoughts, your doubts, your desires. Start saying no to things that don't have a good why. Start being honest about what you actually want. Start living consciously instead of on autopilot. Start. Let me make this practical. Tonight, before you go to bed, take out a piece of paper. Write down the 5 biggest things in your life: your job, your relationship, your home, your goals, your daily habits. Next to each one, write why. Not because I have to, not because it's expected, not because I always have. The real why, the honest why. If you can't come up with an answer that actually means something to you, circle that item. Those circled items, those are the places where you're living someone else's life. Those are the prisons you've built for yourself without even realizing it. Now ask yourself, what would you do differently if you were living according to your why? Write that down too, and then do it. Not tomorrow, not when things calm down, not when you have more time. Now, if you want to change careers, start researching tonight. If you want to repair a relationship, pick up the phone today. If you want to learn something new, sign up for a class this week. If you want to open a blank document right now. The why gives you direction, but action is what moves you forward. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait until you're 74 years old to start asking the questions that matter. Ask them now, answer them honestly, and then live accordingly. I'm 81 years old. I've been living consciously for 7 years, 7 years out of 81. That's less than 10% of my life, but these 7 years have been more meaningful than the 74 that came before, because I finally know why I'm here, why I'm doing what I'm doing, why my days matter, not because someone told me, not because it's expected, not because it's practical, because I chose it consciously after asking the hard questions. That's the gift my grandson gave me. An 8-year-old boy asking why about something I'd never questioned. He saved my life, or at least he saved what was left of it. I wish I had started sooner. God, I wish I had started sooner. I wish I had asked myself why at 23 when I was deciding on a career. I wish I had asked why at 30 when I was making choices about family and home. I wish I had asked why at 40 when I felt that first stirring of doubt, but I didn't. I was too scared, too busy, too committed to staying asleep. So I lost 55 years of autopilot, of going through motions, of living someone else's answers. I can't get those years back. Nobody can give them to me, but I can use the years I have left, and I can tell you what I've learned. The why matters more than the what. Direction matters more than speed. Meaning matters more than success. And the questions you're afraid to ask are exactly the ones you need to answer. I am not bitter. I am not angry. I am grateful. Grateful that I woke up at all. Grateful that I had 7 years instead of 0. Grateful that my grandson asked me a question I couldn't answer. Some people never wake up. Some people never ask why. They live their whole lives on autopilot and die without ever knowing who they really were. That's not going to be me, and I don't want it to be you. You have a choice right now. You can close this video and go back to your life exactly as it was. Keep answering what and how. Keep staying too busy to ask why. Keep running on the hamster wheel until you're 70, 80, 90 years old. Or you can stop right now, today, this moment. You can ask yourself the question that matters. Why am I living this way? And if you don't have a good answer, you can start building a life that does. It's not too late, not for you. You're still young enough to course correct. You're still young enough to build something meaningful. You're still young enough to answer the big questions before the answers find you in a hospital room or a funeral home, but you have to start now, not tomorrow, not next year, not when you retire, now, because time doesn't wait, and neither should you. The permission you've been waiting for, this is it. Ask why. Answer honestly. Live accordingly. That's the whole secret. That's everything I've learned in 81 years on this planet. 3 words. Ask, answer, live. Don't waste 55 years learning what I learned. The question is simple. Why are you here? Not what are you doing? Not how are you surviving? Why? Answer that and everything else falls into place. Someday is today. It always has been. The why has been waiting for you. All you have to do is ask. If this resonated with you, I hope you'll share it. Not for me. I don't need the views. I'm 81, but somewhere out there is a 30-year-old who's about to make the same mistake I made. A 40-year-old who's ignoring that voice of doubt. A 50-year-old who's telling themselves they'll figure it out later. Maybe this can reach them before it's too late. Subscribe if you want to hear more. I have other things to say, and I'm not sure how much time I have left to say them. Leave a comment. Tell me your why, or tell me what you're finally ready to ask yourself. I read every single one. Your time is precious. Thank you for spending some of it with me. Now go, ask the question, live the answer.